Alrighty, everyone. It is Sunday, October 5th, 2025. I am Michael Winkler, and this is the Mike Wink Show. So let's hop right into it. U.S. FCC to consider ending merger ban amongst U.S. broadcast networks. This administration continuing on with their theme of being the most pro-corporate power consolidation, pro-monopoly, anti-consumer presidency we've ever seen. The U.S. Federal Communications Commission voted on Tuesday to consider whether to lift the long-standing prohibition on a merger between any of the largest four broadcast networks and to consider relaxing other media ownership rules. The FCC said it would consider public comments before deciding whether to reverse the rule that bars a merger between the big four networks: NBC, owned by Comcast, Walt Disney's ABC, Paramount, Skydance's CBS, or Fox. Just contrast this. Just contrast them wanting to lax the rules about corporate consolidation of power versus the Biden admin, FCC head, and other lawyers and their DOJ that was going after, like, trying to actually enforce antitrust rules and antitrust laws that have been on the books but more or less unenforced for decades and decades, which has created the scenario in which we're in now, where, like, you have extreme corporate consolidation of power, right? I mean, most people have seen those infographics, and it shows like all of the major brands that you can think of like cereal and cereal brands and TV, electronic brands and everything, and how, like, well, this company owns this company, and this company owns this company, and it all kind of merges into, like, a handful of giga companies that seem to own like all of the smaller ones, and therefore create a trust, right? They create a sort of false market, false competition between their own entities. Right. And so that's how we only got to this point through a lack of enforcement of the antitrust laws we already have on the books. We just haven't been enforcing them for decades. And so, yeah, Biden administration comes in and tries to actually start enforcing them, which was like the first time any president or any administration had made a serious effort towards antitrust in decades. And then you have Trump come in and do the exact polar opposite, right? Not only does he it's not like he went back to the previous Republicans' position where it was like, oh, maybe, more neutral or ambivalent about corporate consolidation of power. But like, this is overtly like he wants to, this isn't just like being pro, this is like actively facilitating giant mergers that otherwise would not have happened under a different administration, or if we just enforced these antitrust laws in the first place. The FCC also said it was seeking public comment on whether to eliminate or revise a rule that limits a single entity from owning more than two of the four largest television stations in the same local market, and a rule that limits the total number of local radio stations that may be owned in a single market. I wonder who this helps, right? Is this really help the... Bro, this is just so cynical. Why would you this is just another one of those things, right? This administration keeps doing things that there really isn't like a good faith argument for, right? Like, so many things, typically you have to present sort of plausible deniability argument, right? But like, the only plausible, somewhat logical argument I can think of for this is like a 100% maximal laissez-faire capitalism type mindset, where you're like, literally any restriction on any market under any circumstances is bad and should be taken away, which obviously is a really stupid, simplistic way of looking at governance and society and whatnot. But like, I just can't come up with a good faith argument for this, right? I can only really come up with cynical arguments, right? And the cynical arguments are, well, these corporations want to consolidate even more, and they know that they can't or they couldn't under Biden administration or previous administrations, but the time is ripe now, and they've got their boy Donnie in office, and all they need to do is kiss his ass a little bit, and he'll probably just be like, yeah, you guys can merge, whatever, I don't care, you can just kiss my ass. So like, there's just I feel like prior to our current political era, at least, like, people had to pretend, they had to have a veneer of plausible deniability, right? But it's gone now. Previously, the FCC noted that a version of the rule barring dual ownership of networks has existed since the 1940s. A 2018 media ownership review concluded the bar should be upheld. because it advances the agency's core policy objectives of competition and localism. We intend to take a fresh approach to competition by examining the broader media marketplace rather than treating broadcast radio and television as isolated markets, FCC Chair Brendan Carr said. If we determine that any rule no longer serves the public interest, we will fulfill our statutory duty to modify or eliminate those rules. He says basically nothing here, right? All he really does is he says rather than treating broadcast radio and television as isolated markets. Well, like, basically saying we don't see any value in viewing media markets through a more local lens. We don't see any value in ensuring that like all these media arms aren't owned by the same person, right? Or the same company, right? We already have a problem that so many of these local news stations and local radio stations are already owned by a handful of big companies, and they all kind of project the same thing, right? They all get their marching orders from the top. And I'm sure some of them do some amount of local reporting to maintain some veneer of locality. But yeah, he doesn't really say anything, right? He basically just says, we don't care about viewing it through the lens of local based, local markets of media ownership or whatever. We don't care about that. And also, we can do whatever we want. Na 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 boo boo. We control the government. So in 2017, the FCC voted to eliminate the 42-year-old ban on cross-ownership of a newspaper and TV station in a major market. It also voted to make it easier for media companies to buy additional local TV stations in the same market. The only thing that can come to mind when I read an article like this, especially this last paragraph, is like it's only going to amplify some of the problems that we already have in our modern media landscape. And that like people are so siloed. People end up in their own media bubbles, right? They go to watch Fox News, but they don't watch anything else because they think any other news organization to the left of Fox News is essentially like socialist communist propaganda for the Democratic Party or something, right? Like we have whole swaths of the country who believe that kind of nonsense. And this is only going to amplify, right? This is only going to solidify and more institutionalize these media silos that kind of have been established over the last few decades. And it's only going to further entrench people in these like ideological wormholes. People like to talk about algorithms. And one way I like to think about it is like most people don't go out of their way to search out things, right? They kind of consume mostly what's spoon-fed to them. So they consume whatever like the Netflix recommendations are. They go on Twitter and they just consume whatever the Twitter algorithm is giving them. They go on YouTube, they watch their YouTube home feed or whatever. The algorithm is feeding them. They don't really go outside of what the algorithm is telling them to do. Well, this will only exacerbate the problems with that, because then even if they do try and go out of like this immediate bubble that they're in, oftentimes, well, wait, hold on. The new bubble that they go to is also owned by this same person. It's really one giant bubble, and they've disguised it to make it seem like they're a different couple of bubbles, but really it's all part of the same one. I don't know. All I can imagine is that this is going to exacerbate the problem of political partisanship, right? People are going to be more siloed than they even are. And this is just a complete repudiation of all the efforts the Biden administration made trying to bring back the enforcement of antitrust rules and to ensure more fair, more public interest, more consumer-oriented competition in these marketplaces. Not fake competition where the same one company owns all 5 of the companies in this market and they all compete against each other, when really it's just the same company owning all 5 and they're not actually competing and it's fake competition and blah, 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 blah. So yeah, this is supremely dumb and honestly supremely corrupt, right? So many of these mergers we've already seen, like we've already seen corruption. Basically, they have to come out, they have to kiss the ring, kiss the ring, and then they're allowed to get their merger, right? This happened with Colbert, right? Didn't they fire Stephen Colbert or end his show and basically like to get approval for this big merger that probably otherwise would not have been allowed if they didn't follow Trump's request and kick Stephen Colbert off the air? Now, I've heard some people say about that like, well, his show was losing money or whatever. It was the top rated show in that bracket of like late night, like Jimmy Fallon-esque, like talking head, comedic, general public, like, trying to appeal to a wide audience type thing. So like from that perspective, he's the most popular one by far, gets the highest viewership. There's no way they were going to cut his show, the highest viewership one of the entire category. No shot, okay? They may have modified the show over the next few years to make it a bit more profitable, but there's no conceivable way that they were going to kick him off. No shot. Hedge fund billionaire pressed Treasury Secretary for Argentina bailout. Argentine media reports. So I don't know if anybody's heard about this. I need to know a little bit more about this. So hopefully this article will clear up some misconceptions I might have. But my understanding basically is that like the Argentinian stock market like full on collapsed. Like it's the worst in the world at this, or it was just like a couple weeks ago or something. And that the Trump administration came in and said, you know what, we're just going to basically give you $20 billion to like fix this, right? We're going to take a syringe of $20 billion and just inject it right into the Argentinian stock market's veins to try and like bring them up and to try and, take them out of the hole that they're in, right? The hole that largely, to some degree, their turbo-libertarian president, Javier Milei, caused with, his not entirely economically sound policies. Well, one reason I heard for, one thing you might think about this is like, why would they want to do this? Well, one thing I heard, and I'm thinking that this article is going to corroborate this, is that a bunch of U.S.-based billionaires basically dumped a bunch of money into the Argentinian stock market and economy when Milei was elected on the false idea that like, well, I guess they're libertarians and they believe in libertarian economics or whatever, and they really thought it was going to blow up. Well, it did the exact opposite. It blew up in the bad way, and the stock market tanked. And now the billionaires are coming crawling to Trump saying, we helped you get elected. Help bail us out, baby. So let's see if that's actually what's happening. On September 24th, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced a $20 billion package to rescue the Argentinian economy. It was a dramatic move to bail out a country that has little economic impact on the United States. Argentine President Javier Milei is scheduled to meet President Trump at the White House later this month. On Monday, Popular Information revealed that the tax-funded bailout had massive economic benefits for hedge fund billionaires Rob Citrone, a personal friend and former colleague of Bessent. Citrone's fund, Discovery Capital, had bet heavily on Argentina, purchasing Argentine debt and equity in numerous companies closely tied to the country's overall economy. Citrone's investments reflected his belief that Milei's right-wing economic program, which emphasizes deregulation and sharply reduced government spending, would revitalize the Argentine economy. That theory began to unravel as growth slowed, unemployment spiked, and Milei's popularity tanked. This spring, Citrone reportedly urged Bessent to help Milei secure a separate $20 billion package from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF funds began to arrive in April, but proved insufficient to turn the Argentine economy around. Concerns turned into panic after Milei's party was routed in the Buenos Aires provincial election in early September, fueling fears that Milei would soon lose control of the economic agenda. Investors began dumping the peso and liquidating other Argentine assets, which spelled major trouble for Citrone's hedge fund. So everything's lining up with the way I put it. Oh, gosh. Sometimes it sucks being right, and everything so far is lining up exactly with what I thought the situation was. Major Argentine media outlets are now reporting that Citrone asked Bessent for a United States rescue package. Ariel Maciel, political economy editor at Perfil, a large Argentine media outlet, wrote that after Buenos Aires elections, Citrone returned to his friend and former colleague to request a second bailout, this time from the very coffers Bessent manages, the U.S. Treasury. Yeah, your tax dollars are going to backstop the dumb investment choices of some billionaires that are just buddy-buddy with Trump and members of the Trump administration. That's explicitly what's happening here. CE Noticias Financieras, a major wire service in Latin America, similarly reported that after Argentine officials ran into resistance with lower-level Trump officials, Citrone managed to connect with Bessent to get him to intervene directly. Maciel elaborated on his reporting during an appearance on Net TV, an Argentine broadcaster. Quote, Citrone is really the one who intervenes. He basically tells Bessent, hey, we need help in Argentina, Maciel said during the segment. Popular Information contacted Discovery Capital and asked if the reports that Citron asked Bessent to bail out Argentina were accurate. Discovery Capital declined to comment. Wow, I could have guessed what that last sentence was going to say. I would have bet a lot of money that it was going to say they declined to comment. Of course they did. Maciel also noted that 2 weeks before Bessent announced the bailout, Citron purchased additional bonds for almost nothing. Maciel said the timing of Citron's recent purchases has raised suspicions that Citron had access to confidential information. That is literally the definition of insider trading. But like not only insider trading kind of like on another level, right? Because insider trading, you're only manipulating a private market, right? But like these people are using the levers of government and like cynical connections to the ridiculous Trump administration to like enrich themselves via explicit, blatant insider trading. That's crazy. And also it shows that the dude's not even like Citron was good friends with Trump himself or something, right? At least that would be a little bit more consistent, right? He's just friends with the dude he's just friends with the Treasury Secretary, right? It's not like he's even best friends with Trump or something, right? He's just friends with, bro, they're like full in, like, you know what? I don't think this is just one of those things where it's like, I guess maybe they're relying on the cross-continent, cross-country, cross-language, like lack of reporting, lack of connection that most Americans are going to make, like to be so explicit about this, right? Like, I mean, for these Argentine media outlets to know that Citron asked Bessent, that probably means Citron like did some sort of interview admitting that this is exactly what happened. And the only reason I think he would be comfortable enough to make that kind of admittance is knowing that, like, well, in Argentina is probably, I don't know if they have insider trading rules in Argentina, but I would view, it would not surprise me if they did not have any rules like that. And he's also relying on the fact that, like, look, Americans don't pay attention. There's already so much going on domestically. You know, most of them don't read Spanish or whatever, so they're not going to be able to, like, actually look into the articles from the primary source. So they're going to rely on secondary sources to find it. This is just absolute rank, brazen corruption, and it is coming straight out of the pocket of every American, right? That $20 billion that they're just going to give to that they're just going to just literally give to the Argentinian stock market or whatever as a backstop for all these billionaire buddies of members of the Trump administration so they cannot lose as much on their dumb investments on the insane libertarian economy promises from Milei. This is just like a cascade of stupid, all right? This is just a cascade of stupid, and it's just like, it is just pure corruption at the expense of the American taxpayer. That's all this is. Amid shutdown fight, Trump is no longer distancing himself from Project 2025. Now, I'm sure that you all are aware the government is currently shut down. Now, the official reason why the shutdown is happening right now is because it needs to pass some sort of continuing resolution or some sort of official budget on the Senate to prevent a government shutdown. So about like 6 months ago, the Senate passed an appropriations bill. Now, the appropriations process is different, right? I'm not going to get too into the technical details, but basically to pass an appropriations bill, you only need 50 votes. You only need a simple majority. But to pass an official Senate budget resolution, you need a 60-vote threshold. The reconciliation bill that they passed 6 months ago, right, was passed only with Republicans, and they squeezed in some stuff that like Democrats really, really don't like, right? They took away ACA subsidies, which I believe reduces the cost of anybody getting their health insurance through an ACA marketplace by like 100%, 120%. So basically anybody that's on ACA programs, which I think was something like 10% of all people insured in the United States, have some of those costs covered by these ACA subsidies, and which amounts to about half of the cost. So the people in these ACA programs, and the ACA is supposed to be an insurance program for people on the lower income brackets, they get their costs reduced even more. Well, the removal the Republicans already did through the reconciliation bill 6 months ago, and they're wanting to solidify now in the actual Senate budget bill, is the removal of these ACA subsidies. And the only thing that removing these ACA subsidies will do is basically a little bit over double the cost of healthcare for anybody who gets their insurance through the ACA marketplace, which, like I said, is somewhere between like 7 and 10% of all insured people in the United States. Oh, yeah. And those 7 to 10% are some of the poorest people who have insurance in the United States. So basically, all this does is just increase the cost of healthcare for poor people for basically like for really no reason. I mean, you can't pretend this is about budgetary reasons because this administration has clearly shown on so many different levels that they are not fiscally conservative. They don't care about balancing the budget. This isn't about like economics or anything like that, right? So you can't possibly make that argument in good faith. So what is this about? Well, this is about just like making poor people's lives worse. Like it's just another one of those things where like you can't really come up with like a super good faith, plausible deniability argument for this, right? It's really just like bad. It's just bad for no reason. Those are the official reasons why the government is shut down right now, right? The technical official reasons. But the real reason I've heard, and I'm hoping that this article will substantiate this a little bit, is that this was essentially all part of Project 2025, right? And the guy, Russ Vought, who's kind of heading all of the shutdown stuff, was literally one of the authors of Project 2025. Well, what does it say about doing this? Well, there was a lot of backlash when they tried to cut government agencies unilaterally using Doge like 6 months ago or whatever, right? There's a lot of backlash on that. Some of it got reversed, and they weren't able to do quite as much as they hoped. Well, the plan, what I've heard basically, is that the Trump administration wanted this government shutdown. And the reason why they wanted the government shutdown is because so they could basically achieve all their Doge goals with, through sort of a loophole, right? So what happens when the government shuts down like this is that like millions and millions of government employees are put on furlough, which is basically like temporarily, you aren't getting paid, but you're not fired, right? Basically everything's on pause, and that you should get paid whenever things pick back up, and that your job will continue whenever things pick back up and everything like that. Well, the loophole that they're trying to exploit is basically like shut down the government. Everybody gets furloughed by the agency heads officially, and then they direct the agency heads, which the Supreme Court is increasingly saying the president has authority over these agency heads and these agencies in general to shift all these furloughed employees over to expulsion or to firing them. There's a word for it. It started with R. There's like a technical word they use, but I can't remember exactly what it is. But basically, they're going to, direct these agency heads to go, okay, all those furloughed employees, fire them. And doing so is just going to absolutely cripple most of these agencies, or at least the agencies that they're wanting to go after, and basically achieve their goals of undermining Congress, of cutting these Democrat government agencies that help everyday people without having to go through Congress. President Donald Trump is openly embracing the conservative blueprint he desperately tried to distance himself from during the 2024 campaign, as one of its architects works to use the government shutdown to accelerate his goals of slashing the size of the federal workforce and punishing Democratic states. He desperately tried to distance himself from during the 2024 campaign. Anybody who thought that Trump wasn't like for or connected with or like in just ambivalent towards the Project 2025, I've got some real estate to sell you in the Sahara. In a post on his Truth Social site Thursday morning, Trump announced he would be meeting with his budget chief, Russ Vought, he of Project 2025 fame, to determine which of the many Democrat agencies, most of which are a political scam, he recommends to be cut, and whether or not those cuts will be temporary or permanent. The comments represented a dramatic about face for Trump, who spent much of the last year denouncing Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's massive proposed overhaul of the federal government, which was drafted by many of his longtime allies and current and former administration officials. Asked about Trump's reversal, White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson said, "Democrats are desperate to talk about anything aside from their decision to hurt the American people by shutting down the government." Bro, all they can do is deflect to the Democrats. It's actually kind of cringe how like every time they're asked a question about anything, they can only say the Democrats, even in scenarios where it doesn't make any damn sense at all, right? They're just relying on people not paying attention. And, who are they speaking to, right? Well, they're speaking to their base who doesn't pay attention or look up anything when they say Democrats are desperate and blah, 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 blah. They blame everything on the Democrats. Top Trump campaign leaders spent much of 2024 livid at the Heritage Foundation for publishing a book full of unpopular proposals that Democrats tried to pin on the campaign to To warn a second Trump term would be too extreme. While many of the policies outlined in its 900-plus pages aligned closely with the agenda that Trump was proposing, particularly on curbing immigration and dismantling certain federal agencies, others called for action Trump had never discussed, like banning pornography, or Trump's team was actively trying to avoid, like withdrawing approval for abortion medication. Trump repeatedly insisted he knew nothing about the group or who was behind it, despite his close ties with many of its authors. They included John McEntee, his former director of the White House Presidential Personnel Office, and Paul Dans, former chief of staff of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. I know nothing about Project 2025, Trump insisted in 2024. In July 2024. I have no idea who is behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Anything they do, I wish them luck, but I have nothing to do with them. Trump's campaign chiefs were equally critical. President Trump's campaign has been very clear for over a year that Project 2025 had nothing to do with the campaign, did not speak for the campaign, and should not be associated with the campaign or the president in any way, wrote Susie Wiles and Chris LaCavita in a campaign memo. They added reports of Project 2025's demise would be greatly welcomed and should serve as notice to anyone or any group trying to misrepresent their influence with President Trump and his campaign. It will not end well for you. Trump has since gone on to stalk his second administration with its authors, including Vought, border czar Tom Homan, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, immigration hardliner Stephen Miller, and Brandon Carr, who wrote Project 2025's chapter on the Federal Communications Commission and now chairs the panel. Yeah, the whole idea that the guy who wrote the whole chapter on how they want to undermine the power of the FCC and usurp it and whatnot, in this like draconian weird Project 2025 thing they put out, right? He's literally the guy that like he's literally the head of the FCC now, right? This is beyond regulatory capture, right? Because like regulatory capture sort of implies like that these agencies are being headed by this exact companies that they're directed to oversight. And that is true. But it's kind of worse, right? It's kind of like a step up from the private regulatory capture that I just mentioned, because it's not like Brendan Carr is shilling for AT&T or whatever, right? He's shilling for the larger ideological movement who's against like the government functioning properly in general. So like I think this is like regulatory capture on steroids, because it's like even worse. It's not just for the bottom line of private companies. It's also for their weird, disgusting ideological project. Heritage did not respond to a request for comment Thursday, but Dans, the project's former director, said it's been exciting to see so much of what was laid out in the book put into action. It's gratifying. We're very proud of the work that was done for this express purpose. To have a doer like President Trump ready to roll on day one, said Dans, who is currently running for Senate against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. Since his swearing in, Trump has been pursuing plans laid out in Project 2025 to dramatically expand presidential power and reduce the size of the federal workforce. They include efforts like the Department of Government Efficiency and budget rescission packages, which have led to billions of dollars being stalled, scrapped, or withheld by the administration so far this year. I've said this many times before, but like I hate this conservative, like this brain rot that's on the conservative side of politics right now, and reduce the size of the federal workforce, right? They're saying like reducing the size of the federal workforce or reducing the size of the government or whatever is like inherently good, right? It's the really dumb small government versus big government argument, right? And they're on the side of, well, I think small government is better and big government is bad inherently, and therefore the government doing anything is bad, basically, right? And that we should do as little with the government as possible. But like that's just really dumb when you consider like there are good things the government does, there are bad things the government does, right? And the correct amount of government is the correct amount of government, right? The correct amount of government is one that's not too big, but also one that's not too small, if I'm going to use their verbiage on this. you want a government, you want a government that works for the people and does good things and improves the country. And that might mean big or small, depending on what your definition of big or small is. But to just say like big government bad and therefore government doing stuff bad, therefore reducing the federal workforce just broadly is a good thing doesn't make any sense. It's just pure brain rot. They are now using the shutdown to accelerate their progress. Ahead of the funding deadline, OMB directed agencies to prepare for additional mass firings of federal workers, rather than simply furloughing those who are not deemed essential, as has been the usual practice during past shutdowns. Vought told House GOP lawmakers in a private conference call Wednesday that layoffs would begin in the next day or two. That's what I'm saying, right? This was the plan from the beginning, right? They wanted this government shutdown. And also, right, like Trump himself has said, who takes, like on the campaign trail many years ago, he said, when asked who takes the blame for a government shutdown, he said it lies in the hands of the president, right? The president gets the blame for a government shutdown. So if that's his belief, then you'd think he'd be adverse to a government shutdown. Well, I think he's willing to put that aside because this was the plan all along. They wanted to cut these federal agencies, but they were unable to do so through their DOGE program, and they would be unable to do so through Congress because it would be far too unpopular to vote out much of these agencies. So the only way they can do it is through some cynical, weird loophole like this, where they just undermine the power of Congress and everything. They have also used the shutdown to target projects championed by Democrats, including canceling $8 billion in green energy projects in states with Democratic senators and withholding $18 billion for transportation projects in New York City that have been championed by Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries in their home state. The idea that like the president is going after the idea that the president is like targeting blue states or whatever is almost beyond conceivable, right? He's the president of the United States, right? All 50 of us plus DC and Puerto Rico and all our territories or whatever, right? He's supposed to be the president of the United States, not president of the states that voted for him or that he likes the most, or president for anybody but those that he has a vendetta against, right? His duty is to the country and to the people, right? To facilitate, to improve the welfare, to facilitate the quality of life of as many Americans as possible. But like the idea, bro, and also the idea that like a Democrat would do this to Republicans, bro, they would storm the Capitol again, right? They would lose their goddamn minds. But also, this is, in another way to look at this is Trump and their administration taking away your tax dollars, right? Congress is your vote, right? That is the most direct representation of the people's interest is Congress. And so when the Trump administration unilaterally says we're just going to withhold the funds that your congressperson, the people you voted for, and Congress has the power of the purse, appropriated this money to be used for these reasons, right? For the Trump administration, I don't care where or what the funding is for or where the funding is being withheld from, right? Whether it's a Democrat state or a Republican state, when it's targeted like this, it is actively taking the money out of like the pocket. You are undermining the vote and the democratic process and the governmental representation of any citizen living in a blue state that is subject to this. The moves are part of a broader effort to concentrate federal authority in the presidency, which permeated Project 2025. I wonder if the Republicans are obsessed with, and Republican strategists or whatever are obsessed with consolidating presidential power because they understand the dynamic in which it plays with the Republicans and Democrats. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say this continues on and presidential power continues to be consolidated even more and more, okay? And then 2028 comes along, or maybe even the next election, right? And we've seen even more consolidation. I think the Republican strategists know that the Democrats are a bunch of feckless pussies and are unwilling and are stuck in mud and don't understand how to play the metagame properly, right, from a game theory perspective, and that essentially they aren't going to recognize this consolidation of presidential power, right? They're going to think it's wrong. They aren't going to recognize it or whatever, and they're going to try and basically they're going to undermine themselves, right? They're going to either try and go back to delegating more power to Congress, which is impossible because once the Supreme Court has delegated that power to the president, you can't go back. It's a one-way street. Or they're just going to feel like it's too authoritarian or too bad or whatever to actually use those presidential powers in the way that they should. and that they're just going to not use them basically, and like they're going to abdicate their power in that regard. And so and to me that would be my take, right? If I had to bet money on how the Democrats would react to this kind of end game continued consolidation of presidential power scenario, that's exactly what would happen, right? Every time a Republican got into power, they would do a whole bunch of disgusting things, right? Because they would understand game theory, they understand how to pull the levers of power, and then a Democrat would come in and be like, "Oh, actually, I don't recognize this lever of power. This lever of power, I'm going to pretend like it doesn't exist, and I'm going to go back to these old levers of power, even though the electricity has been cut from those old levers of power and they're useless." I wonder if that kind of deep analysis is going on behind the scenes on the part of the Republicans, and that is the ultimate reason why they want to push for as much presidential authority as possible, or the consolidation of presidential power, is because they are able to take advantage of it much more than the Democrats. In his chapter in the Blueprint, Vought made clear he wanted the president and OMB to wield more direct power. Quote, "The director must view his job as the best, most comprehensive approximation of the president's mind," he wrote. Vought described OMB as, quote, "a president's air traffic control system, which should be involved in all aspects of the White House policy process, becoming powerful enough to override implementing agencies/bureaucracies." Yeah, they're literally saying we want to be able to undermine other parts of the government. We want to be able to undermine other parts of government for our own cynical, purposes, our own ideological goals. Senator Mike Lee of Utah said on Fox News Channel that Vought, quote, "has a plan, and that plan is going to succeed in further empowering Trump. This is going to be the Democrats' worst nightmare," end quote. House Speaker Mike Johnson echoed that message, insisting the government shutdown gives Trump and his budget director vast power over the federal government and the unilateral power to determine which personnel and policies are essential and which are not. Yeah, this is sort of a way that they can go around a whole bunch of the other rules that they are kind of sort of subject to adhering to, right? Like the one regarding the classification of employees, right? There's different classifications of federal employees, right? There's like Class C, Class B, Class A, or whatever. And only certain ones are subject to political appointees, right? The president has the power to appoint the head of the official tippy top head of many of these agencies, and some of the subsequent other more important heads of these agencies. But in general, in theory, he doesn't have the power to just like fire career bureaucrats, subject matter experts that work in the agency. But that's something that's one of the key parts of Project 2025 was they wanted to reclassify whole swaths of the federal workforce so that they can fire and hire them based on political leanings, right? And so if we take the EPA, for instance, they want to be able to implement some sort of policy or some sort of test that says like, all right, we're going to give everybody who works at the EPA this test. And one of the questions could be, do you believe in man-made climate change? And we basically are going to say, look, anybody who answers no to that, anybody who answers yes to that, we're just going to fire them and then rehire them with somebody who will answer no to that question. And so this is just sort of a loophole-y way they can go around many of these protections. Schumer has handed the keys of the kingdom to the president, Johnson said Thursday. Because they have decided to vote to shut the government down, they have now effectively turned off the legislative branch, and they've turned it over to the executive. See, this puts the Democrats this is like a really good strategy from the Republicans, right? Like if I'm going to think about it from a game theory perspective, and it puts the Democrats in a really, really tough spot, right? Because the Democrats right now are sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't, right? They're damned if they sign off on this budget, then they're basically okaying this administration's unilateral control over the purse, right? It's basically it gives the green light for the tariffs that he's doing for impounding and withholding various types of funding for federal agencies that have already been appropriated by Congress. But if the Democrats don't vote for it and they continue to hold firm on this, which in theory is the correct political move, then the Republicans can cynically use this loophole to gut the federal government in a way and to a scale that the Democrats could, in any other scenario would be impossible and would really hurt the Democrats or hurt them with regards to their ideological goals. So yeah, I don't know. This is a really tough spot for the Democrats. I would say if the Democrats knew for a fact that the administration was going to do this as soon as the government shutdown happened, and that they were going to fire millions of federal workers and basically like destroy various federal agencies, then maybe I would be in favor of the Democrats voting for this budget resolution, despite its ACA subsidy rescissions, to ensure that that kind of thing doesn't happen, right? But then if you do that, you're kind of capitulating to like the power plays of the Republicans, and the only lesson it will teach them is that they can continue to keep doing that kind of thing for basically any issue and whatever they want, and the Democrats will bend the knee because they know their finger is over the nuke button, and they're like, oh, if you do it, if you shut down the government, we're gonna nuke. And the Democrats are like, well, we don't want to nuke. Like losing the healthcare package is a bad thing, but nuking is even worse. And so it's like they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. Dems are in a really weird spot for this. Young said the Constitution gives the White House no such power and chastised Republicans in Congress for abandoning their duty to serve as a check on the president. In theory, you would think Congress would want to retain their power, right? In theory, you would think most of these people are narcissists, right? You would think most of these people who spent their lives building up to this point of being a congressperson or whatever wouldn't want to abdicate their power to the buffoon in the presidency. But I think the Republican Party and the conservative movement is just so beholden to Trump at this point that like any Republicans that maybe would want to push back against this know that it's political suicide for them. And so they're like, all right, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and let them do whatever they want, even if it takes away some of my power as a member of Congress. I don't want to hear a lecture about handing the keys over, she said. The keys are gone. They're lost. They're down a drain. This shutdown is not what lost the keys. Yeah, I would think the best strategy has to be just holding firm on this, right? Because as soon as you capitulate because you're worried about what the Trump administration is going to do regarding their weird loophole and firing of furloughed workers, right? As soon as you capitulate on that, you have capitulated on everything, and they can continue to repeat the strategy as many times as they want with whatever issues they want. But yeah, this seems like to align with what I heard about this, right? That the Republicans really did want the government shut down so they could cynically implement their Project 2025 plan of gutting many of these federal agencies and potentially doing so in a politically motivated manner, right? They're wanting to gut agencies the Democrats like more. They're cutting appropriated funding, legally Congress appropriated funding from blue states or whatever. And yeah, this was all planned from the start. This was, the Republicans are in a great spot with this because they're like, oh, if they pass our budget resolution, we're happy because we get the ACA subsidy rescissions actually like written into stone. And if they shut down the government and don't sign onto our budget resolution, then we can continue to then we can gut these federal agencies in a way that we were hoping we otherwise may not have been able to. And yeah, the Democrats are in a really weird spot. And I think, unfortunately, their only logical play moving forward from a strategy perspective is to continue to hold firm on the shutdown. And because as soon as you capitulate on this, with them, as soon as you capitulate because of their threats of what they're going to do to the federal workforce, you have lost all strategic standing. And so yeah, this is genius strategy from the Republicans for terrible ideological reasons, and it puts the Democrats in a really, really tough spot. I'm fascinated to see how this will turn out. My gut tells me that enough Democrats after a couple of weeks are going to bend the knee and they're going to get their budget resolution passed. And honestly, it might be the worst of both worlds, right? It might be 2 or 3 weeks of performative resistance from some of these Democrats who are eventually going to cave. And in that time period, the Trump administration very well could implement many of these firings that they're threatening to do for the government shutdown. So in the way I could totally imagine, and in fact, this might actually very likely be the case, it's going to be the worst of both worlds, right? They're going to shut down the government just long enough that it gives the Republicans in this administration enough time to do their loopholey illegal cuts or whatever to these government agencies. And eventually they're going to get the budget resolution they want passed because the Democrats are going to cave. So I don't think the Democrat Party is equipped for this type of game theory type metagame strategizing for the Republicans. They're getting left in the dust. They're stuck in mud. Trump seizes on shutdown to punish political foes. The White House has cut or paused billions in funding to Democrat-run cities and states since the federal government came to a halt. President Trump has embarked on a legally dubious campaign to weaponize the federal budget during a contentious government shutdown, halting more than $27 billion in approved funding in a bid to punish Democratic-led cities and states. Rather than broker a legislative truce or seek to ameliorate the fallout of a costly fiscal stalemate, the president has leveraged the crisis to exact revenge on rivals, slash federal spending, and pressure Democrats into accepting his political demands. Since the shutdown started on Wednesday, the Trump administration has canceled or delayed federal aid to 16 states, most of them run by Democrats. In the latest example, Russell T. Vought, the White House budget director, said on Friday that the administration would halt about $2.1 billion in approved funding for long-planned transit improvements in Chicago. Okay, I imagine some of those long-planned transit improvements in Chicago were along safety and law enforcement and all these things, right? Which completely undermines, so them wanting to cut that and forcibly and illegally impounding that funding undermines their whole, like, we're sending the National Guard into Chicago and it's a war zone type thing, right? At the exact same time, you're cutting the funding that Chicago was implementing or was going to have implemented to help solve some of these safety problems. It's just, there's just flashing red lights everywhere that none of this is in good faith. And that anybody who can't see these flashing red lights must be colorblind because the light isn't red to them. It's just a light, just gray. And also just imagine for half a second that like a Dem president did this to Republican states, right? They would lose their minds. It would be World War II. They'd probably be calling for a national divorce and a splitting of the country or whatever because they're not well, they're already two separate countries and blah, 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 right? They would lose their minds. So I don't understand how, like, at any point in the future, if a Democrat targets a Republican like this, right, or Republican states or cities, that they could ever be upset about it because Donald Trump is the one that let the cat out of the bag on this one, right? He started it. Mr. Vought claimed the pause was necessary to ensure that the city, which is led by a Democratic mayor in a state with a Democratic governor, had not engaged in, quote, race-based contracting. The White House has also targeted New York, the home state of Democrats' congressional leaders, and concealed nearly $7.6 billion in federal green energy funding, predominantly in Democrat-led states. On Friday, the Trump administration said it could look to slash unspecified aid to Portland soon, after earlier stripping away some of Oregon's infrastructure money. I don't understand how, like, imagine you are a conservative living in Oregon or Portland or whatever, right? And even though these are liberal areas, of course, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that identify on a more conservative ideological basis in the Northwest and in these Democrat cities like Portland, Oregon or whatever. Those people are hurt just as much by you removing their infrastructure money, right? If you're going to impound infrastructure money that would go to improving roads and building bridges and reducing the risk of forest fires and all of those things, right? There's a ton more things that I haven't mentioned. Any conservative living in Portland or Oregon is going to suffer from that too, right? They're going to have worse roads and more potential risks for forest fires and all of that stuff as a direct result of this, right? This is not an attack on just... This is why this seems so silly to me, is because, like, this is not an attack on liberals like they really want to do, right? You're attacking mostly liberals because it's probably mostly liberals that live there, but you're also tangibly hurting any conservative that happens to live in these areas. And I guess they're just banking on the fact that the conservatives who in these areas, and basically conservatives anywhere in the country, don't ever have those moments of like, oh, he's being hypocritical, or, he's undermining his own argument, or, oh, that's not good. They basically never have those moments, right? And I'm just going to fall back to like the era, I think it's because especially I think for the general public, but especially for conservatives, the era of comeuppance is gone. The era of chickens coming home to roost, the era of hypocrisy mattering is gone because of the media, because of this whole media silo algorithm system, right? Because, all these, they can speak out of both sides of their mouth knowing that their conservative constituents are only going to see the clips and videos and quotes from these politicians and whatnot that they support, that are Basically, they're only going to see what they want them to see, and that they're never going to see the contradictory statements that make them think they're hypocritical. And even if they do see that, so many of these people are able to just that's where the commentators come in, right? They present their spin. They're able to, present these kind of negative pieces of information that might undermine their ideological view on these things. The talking heads will spin it in such a way that they don't care. Or they think it actually supports their own argument. So this just seems so this is so predatory and cynical, because I think they have to understand that this tangibly harms any conservatives that happen to be living in these states or cities as well. But they're basically relying on the fact that those conservatives will never stray. They're not going to as a result of this recognize the greater dynamic of what is happening and go, oh, they're the bad guys, I'm going to stop supporting them. I think they're relying on the fact that they're never going to make that analysis, and that they're just going to continue to support them through through the algorithms, through their talking heads, and through this whole right-wing media apparatus that they've constructed. Throughout the week, the president's deputies maintained that they were not politicizing the shutdown and that they sought only to save money and prevent waste. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, told reporters on Friday that the administration had to conduct, quote, a massive review of the bureaucracy to be good stewards of the American taxpayer dollar, end quote, during the shutdown. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, told reporters on Friday that the administration had to conduct, quote, a massive review of the bureaucracy to be good stewards of the American taxpayer dollar, end quote. Okay, that's not their job. The power of the purse lies squarely with Congress if we're balancing the separation of powers properly. If the power of the purse lays squarely with Congress, then in theory, the president has no authority, or should have no authority, over funds appropriated by Congress, regardless of how efficient those funds are being used, or how inefficient those funds are being used, or what those funds are being used for. It doesn't matter. Congress has that power. They've appropriated it. The job of the executive is to use that money, to send that money where it needs to go, so that they can use it for whatever they're supposed to use it for. But Mr. Trump has undercut his aides at every turn. He has suggested that he may try to enact permanent cuts on, quote, Democrat agencies, potentially through mass layoffs, and on social media on Friday, he shared a parody video that referred to Mr. Vought as the Democrats' Reaper. Budget experts said they could not recall a time when a president had weaponized funding in this manner during a shutdown, even when Mr. Trump occupied the White House during the longest closure in U.S. history, a 5-week interruption in late 2018 and early 2019. Yeah, the longest government shutdown in U.S. history happened during the first Trump administration, and it should not act as a shock if an even longer one, or another really, really long one happens here. Matthew Lawrence, a law professor at Emory University who studies federal spending, said the tactics evinced Mr. Trump's belief that he possessed vast unilateral power over the budget, which he could use to coerce states, institutions, and individuals while controlling the narrative on the shutdown. I can't think of a historical parallel of an administration publicly cutting funds in a shutdown like this, Mr. Lawrence said. Yeah, of all the times, too, the government shutdown is when many of these employees and agencies are already being restricted on the amount of funding, or cut off entirely from the amount of funding that they're receiving. So the idea that you're going to further, outside of the context of the government shutdown, even further withhold money is just there's just no good faith argument. It's just pure vindictiveness. You're going after who you perceive as your political enemies. Well, these political enemies are your own countrymen. They're the people they're supposed to be your constituency, the people you're representing as the president of the United States of America. Oh, so dumb. The funding cuts are a stark escalation in Mr. Trump's campaign to cut federal spending and reconfigure the budget in service of his political priorities. Since returning to office, the president has closed agencies and programs while halting or canceling billions of dollars in enacted funds, acting out of a belief that he can override lawmakers to achieve his agenda. Well, he probably can override lawmakers to achieve his agenda through these weird loopholes if none of them are willing to push back or actually hold on to their power, right? If all of the Republicans, which they control all the branches of government, are willing to capitulate to Trump and give him whatever he wants because he has a stranglehold on the conservative movement, then he's able to do, he is able to override whatever he wants. Mr. Trump has attacked funding for science and research, public education, public broadcasting, green energy, transportation and infrastructure, disaster response, federal oversight, and foreign aid. He has often blocked this money because he believes it was being spent wastefully or fraudulently, or because it did not conform to his views on policies like immigration. Like I said before, none of that matters at all. Congress has the explicit powers of the purse, and that it doesn't matter if he thinks the money is being used efficiently or what it's being used for. Congress appropriated that money. Congress is your vote as an American citizen. That's who you vote into office. The Congress has the closest connection to the will of the American people. So yeah, he shouldn't have the authority to do that based on the United States system of checks and balances and separation of powers. States and other recipients have filed dozens of lawsuits to force the release of federal aid, claiming that the president has broken the law by withholding congressionally approved funds. A federal court ordered the Trump administration this week to restore $187 million in counterterrorism funding to New York, which the federal government had stripped without explanation. Why would the Trump administration want to strip $187 million in counterterrorism funding from New York? This is like peak cynical, okay? But like, what is the good faith argument that you can think of for this, right? You can't make a budgetary argument for the reasons I said before, right? This administration has proven they don't care about a balanced budget. You can't make that argument whatsoever. They've undermined it in so many ways that you can't possibly make a balanced budget argument, right? First off. Second off, it's such a small amount of money within the scope of the grander federal budget that like cutting this means nothing with regards to balancing the budget, right? So you can't really make that argument. This is just such a drop in the bucket. Well, why would they want this, right? Well, does he want... Look, I'm going to phrase this as a question, so I'm not explicitly making the statement that this is what they want. Do they want more terrorism attacks in New York? Do they want terror? Do they want New York to experience more terrorist attacks? Do they want that? Because that's the question that comes to mind when I see that kind of thing. Like that is the first question that comes to mind after acknowledging all the things I just said, right? You can't make a budgetary argument. You can't make, I don't know what other argument you would make. This is the most logical argument I can think of, right? And obviously it's cynical and bad faith and disgusting, but it's the only one that makes sense to me, right? That they want more terrorist attacks in New York as a punishment, I guess, for being blue and against Trump or whatever. And also Trump really hates New York now because I believe he had a lawsuit saying he's not allowed to do business in New York at all anymore, right? Didn't that judge say like he's literally not allowed to have a business in New York anymore, right? For Trump, a New Yorker who grew up and spent his entire life in New York, right? And part of his identity is being a businessman or whatever, real estate mogul. That's a big deal. And so I wonder if this is like explicit revenge for that kind of thing. I don't know. Pretty scary. But Mr. Trump has remained undeterred by legal threats and unconstrained by Republicans in Congress. He and Mr. Vought, an architect of the conservative Project 2025 blueprint, have instead seized on the moment to test the limits of their powers. We have the authority to make permanent change in the bureaucracy here in government, Mr. Vought told Fox Business on the eve of the shutdown. Hours into the shutdown, Mr. Vought began by taking aim at New York City. He wrote on social media that the administration would halt $18 billion in infrastructure funding to ensure funding is not flowing based on unconstitutional DEI principles, using the initials for diversity, equity, and inclusion. What most people and what they strategically leave out in so many of these instances is DEI, right? They're purposefully leaving out one letter, right? It's DEIA. The A stands for accessibility, like with regards to like handicap accessibility, like requiring there to be wheelchair ramps at businesses and bathrooms that people in wheelchairs can actually access. That is the part that every time you see DEI, it's DEIA. It's DEIA, and they're leaving out the A part because they understand that even conservatives, if they saw the A part and they understood that, they'd probably be like, well, okay, I'm for ensuring that wheelchair people can exist, the handicapped people can exist and function in our society, right? But they're against, they can, the right-wing media machine can properly spin the DEI part of it. They can't properly spin the A part of it, so they just leave it out, hoping that nobody notices or knows that. The money interrupted two big projects. The Hudson Tunnel project, meant to improve transit under the river between New York City and New Jersey, and the 2nd Avenue subway on the east side of Manhattan. The Transportation Department said it could not not complete a review of money thanks to Senator Chuck Schumer and Representative Hakeem Jeffries, the two New Yorkers who led the Democrats in Congress. Why could the Transportation Department not complete this review? I don't understand. So there is no technical reason, right? The Transportation Department said it could not complete a review of money thanks to Chuck Schumer and Representative Hakeem Jeffries, right? They're not saying that, like, there's no direct way that this is a result of them, right? There's nothing that they did that caused this. This is basically the Trump administration coming out and saying, we're just not going to do what you want us to do, and we're not going to help you out because you're stalling the budget. We're just not going to do. It's not like the Transportation Department isn't doing any reviews anymore, right? I'm sure they're still doing other types of reviews, but they're basically saying we're just not going to review this one because we don't like you and we want to punish you. Miss Hochul said her state had spent decades of waiting and waiting and waiting for the money. We are definitely being punished, not for being a blue state, but for being the home of the leaders, she said. The next day, Mr. Vaught took aim at almost $7.6 billion in clean energy funding from 223 projects across 16 states, including California, Illinois, and New York. He called the money Green New Scam funding to fuel the left's climate agenda. This is the frigging word salad nonsense. The pure conspiratorial nonsense that this administration is pushing, right? Just so anti-intellectual, just so inherently, fundamentally anti-intellectual. We have the authority to make permanent change in the bureaucracy here in government, Russell T. Vaught, the White House budget director, said. And when they say that, they're referring to the budget. Obviously, that's the most important thing. Money, it all comes back to the dollar, baby, the cha-ching. Energy Secretary Chris Wright told Fox Business on Friday that the government was blocking the money for now because it was punishing the wasteful spending of taxpayer dollars. Yeah, they're literally saying we're using the word punishing. They're using the word punishing. Like, this is what I'm saying. They don't care about trying to appear impropriety or lack of bias, or they don't care about any of that. It's so hard to even conceive of, because like when I see something like this, I'm like, all I can think of is like, how can conservatives eat this shit up? How can they see this and still be for what this administration and the Republicans are doing and pushing for? But then I have to realize they're not seeing this. They're not seeing this on purpose because of the way the algorithms and our whole siloed media, apparatus is set up and everything. It's part of this. It's part of the design. It's not a bug. It's a feature that they won't see this kind of thing. The Department of Energy considered more extensive cuts, totaling about $20 billion in a broader roster of states led by both parties, according to a person familiar with the matter who requested anonymity to describe private budget records. The administration chose to slash funds in 16 states, for now, many of them led by Democrats. It seems that most of these grants are in either blue states or areas that Kamala Harris won. It feels very political, said Representative Suzanne Bonamici, a Democrat from Oregon. It feels very political. Ms. Bonamici's district west of Portland had expected to benefit from some of the canceled green energy infrastructure funding, which would have helped improve the region's energy grid. They are funds that Congress already authorized, she added. In the opening days of the shutdown, Republicans rallied behind the White House, arguing that Democrats were to blame because they did not accept the president's demands and support a short-term measure to fund the government into November. Democrats had opposed the approach because it would not have extended expiring subsidies that help millions afford health insurance. What they have to do is make very difficult decisions, Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana said of the White House this week. He said Mr. Vaught takes no pleasure in this. Bro, what bullshit? He takes no pleasure in this. Look at how he's talking about this. Look at how the administration's talking about all of this. He literally wrote this. He was the author of this in Project 2025, or one of the authors of all of this in Project 2025, right? The idea that he takes no pleasure in this, like this is like a that this is like a bad medicine you need to swallow, right? Like, oh, it tastes bad, but it's good for you. So you take no pleasure in it, but you have to take the medicine. No. That's so hilarious. takes no pleasure in this. Bro, this is what he's been building up to his entire political career, is getting to a point where getting into a position in an administration where he can do this kind of thing, right? Takes no pleasure in this. Bro, he has wet dreams thinking about this. I guarantee it. Saren Lindgren Savage, a lawyer at Protect Democracy, an open government group, said Americans should be skeptical of stated reasons for Mr. Trump's spending decisions given the multiple other instances in which he has interfered with congressionally enacted funding. Ms. Lyndon Savage's organization sued Mr. Vaught in April after the White House Budget Office disabled a database required by law to track the flow of enacted funds. In July, a judge forced the White House to release those budget logs, which showed that the Trump administration appeared to limit the release of funds to some agencies until they agreed to spend in line with the president's priorities. All of this is a pure undermining of Congress's power of the purse, right? Congress, like I stated a couple times already, Congress has the power of the purse in the way that our United States government system of checks and balances and separation of powers works. Congress has the power of the purse. And so the president, the head of the executive, doesn't have the ability, or he can't just unilaterally decide, like, you know what, I like this, I don't like this, like basically disregard and pick and choose what Congress has decided upon with regards to the budget and spending and government programs and things like that. This is a complete undermining of our entire system of checks and balances. Before the database was restored, the Government Accountability Office had raised alarms about its ability to conduct oversight of the administration. That office has determined that Mr. Trump and his aides repeatedly violated a 1970s law that prohibits presidents from withholding money enacted by Congress. Yeah, we have an explicit law against this, but you put aside the way that the separation of powers should work in theory, right? Balancing them against each other. We also have a law against this. The tactic known as impoundment has held up money meant to upgrade school buses, fund libraries, and respond to national disasters, the office's investigations have found. Mr. Trump's top aides have rejected those findings, sought to discredit the congressional office, and challenged the anti-impoundment law as unconstitutional. The Government Accountability Office has retained legal counsel in preparation for a potentially landmark lawsuit against the White House, according to documents previously viewed by the New York Times. So yeah, all of this is a complete, huge undermining of our separation of powers, of the system of checks and balances that we, in theory, do and should have in the United States, in the way our government functions and is designed. And also, I just can't help but think, like, just imagine for half a second that, like, that a Democrat comes into office and then he starts cynically cutting funds from red states or whatever because he doesn't like them, or like they voted against him, this is an undermining of the system of checks and balances of a properly functioning government. This is an undermining of the will of the people, of the constituency, of taxpayers, Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, because regardless if you're conservative or liberal or not, if you're living in one of these states or cities that has their funding cut, that is funding you voted for, right? You voted for a congressperson who voted for that sort of thing to appropriate money and that kind of thing, right? So you are tangibly being hurt by this. And that we have the idea of this Russ Vaught guy, the guy who's like, his whole ethos is undermining the government and making sure it doesn't function properly and reducing the size of it at all costs. This whole small government versus big government brain rot. The idea that this guy is the head of what is he the head of? The idea that this guy is the budget director, the guy who's in theory supposed to be in charge of, like, broadly in charge of how the government handles the shutdown. Just, we're past satire, bro. This isn't even satire, though. Like, this is like, what would satire be for, like, somebody who's, like, deep into politics, and, like, this is like dark satire. This is dark political satire right here. But Dennis Prager, the founder of PragerU, is apparently paralyzed from the neck down. Now, I learned about this just a week ago. Apparently what happened is he fell in, he's like an old guy, right? He's almost 80 years old. Apparently last November, he fell at some point in his house. I don't know what he was doing, but he fell and broke one of the upper vertebrae in his neck, to the point where he was totally paralyzed from the neck down. and that he has had to spend the last almost full year in various forms of physical recovery, I'm sure, or physical therapy and those kind of things to get to the point where he can at least talk like this. I mean, he's obviously still paralyzed from the neck down, and I'm sure at his age, at 80 years old, the idea that he's ever not going to be paralyzed from the neck down is probably gone, right? He's probably going to be like that for the rest of his life. This is just one of my worst nightmares, man. Like, I wouldn't wish this on anybody, right? I don't care. You know, I don't look at like the ideals and the ideology somebody pushes. I kind of try to separate it from them as a person. Now, when it comes to somebody like Dennis Prager or like Charlie Kirk or somebody who's like spent their whole life trying to push this ideological project and getting as many other people on board with it as possible, I think is very different than like just some dude who has an opinion, right? And isn't, you know, and has a regular job and isn't spending all their time trying to like push this ideological project. But like, even for those types of people, right, I could still to some degree make that type of separation and go, I still don't, from a human being to human being type perspective, I still don't wish neck down quadriplegic paralyzation on you, right? Like, I may think the ideas that you're pushing are bad. I may think that your work is tangibly harmful to the country. But like, from a human being perspective, man, that seems so terrible. The idea of going from being a regular, you know, fully functioning person to being paralyzed totally from the neck down, that is so rough. And so we're going to watch a couple clips of him talk about it. He says that he spent he spent the first however many months of it on, you know, we'll just let him talk.
There are very few short versions. It is a remarkable thing that I am on video and speaking. When you first saw me, I was not even speaking. I think the first 3 months when I was on full ventilator, meaning that it did all the breathing for me. No one can speak while on full vent. So I would point a laser beam at letters. I mean, it was, I'm amazed I didn't go crazy. Let me tell you a story. I don't know if you know this. I hope you don't. It'll keep your interest more. You know, I talk about everything with callers to my radio show. I don't remember how the subject came up, but about 15 or 20 years ago, some guy calls in and says he'd rather be dead than a quadriplegic. And a rare moment for me, I sort of yelled at a caller. And I said, you got to be kidding. You have your mind and you can speak, and you rather be dead because you can't move your limbs? And irony of ironies, my theory was tested. That's exactly my condition. And I'm thrilled to be alive. We are all our mind and our ability to communicate. Would I wish I could move my limbs? I dream about moving my limbs almost every night. Of course I would love it. But I'm alive and I have my loved ones. And I have the public. And I think I could still make a difference. Would I rather be dead? It's inconceivable. I love life. And I love so many people. And of course, I love my wife.
I've met plenty of these people, and I'm sure plenty of y'all have as well, had conversations with people who say, you know, yeah, I'd rather be dead than paralyzed, or I'd rather be dead than be in his position where I'm paralyzed from the neck down or whatever. And like, I've never been able to jive with that kind of position because just like Dennis, like, I love life. There are so many things in life that I find enjoyment from. And I would argue that for me, I find a baseline enjoyment in just existing, right? it is a gift that we even exist in the first place, right? I know he thinks of it as a gift like ordained by God, but from my perspective, it's an even greater gift because it's almost an impossibility, right? Like life is this weird like chemical miracle that happens under the perfect conditions in our universe, and that we have no other evidence of it ever happening again. And considering we have, and from coming from the perspective that there probably is no God and there probably is no afterlife, that whenever we die, this is it, right? Like you have your existence, and then once your eyes shut off, once you're dead and you're put in that box in the ground, it's GG. And so from that position, I think it's even more of a gift, the miracle of you being conscious, watching this video, being able to make the mental connections to food or to other people and whatnot is a miracle, is a gift, depending on how you want to define the word gift, is really a gift that should be valued, that you should recognize all of this and go, you know what, to the extent that all of that is true, and to the extent that I'm a master of my own destiny, and I'm able to to some extent control my mood, control what things are important to me, control how all of these things affect quality of life. I've always been of his same perspective that like even in the worst scenarios, you're going to find some value, like there is value in life, and that like it is important to have a mindset that finds the value in just living.
And my motto, if nothing's horrific, life is terrific.
I love his perspective on this. I could not agree more. And seeing somebody like him, who's like, even though I disagree with his ideology, it's an intelligent, well-spoken person and a public figure like this, have something like this happen to them, they become paralyzed from the neck down. It makes it seem a bit less scary than it did before, right? It's still obviously scary, and obviously you don't want to be paralyzed right like that. But prior to seeing him talk about this, seeing him talk about this gives me a little bit of, it eases the concern a little bit. Like, okay, you still can be a happy person. Here's a person who says that they still love life, that they're still happy, and that it sounds like I share some of like the philosophical perspectives on life with, that I might, if something like this were to happen to me, might have a similar perspective, or I might go through a similar logical reasoning to, to determine which sort of mood or how I felt about the whole situation. But yeah, I agree with everything he's saying about needing to love life, trying to find joy where there is joy, and that as long as everything isn't terrible, there is something that you can find joy in. There's something that you can find gratification in. The mind is the interface through which we connect to everything, right? Without it, you wouldn't be conscious. You wouldn't be able to see. You wouldn't be able to do anything. And so if this is really everything and everything else is kind of just dressing on it, as long as you still have this, regardless if you can walk or do anything like that, you should still be able to, hopefully, still be able to find some joys in life and some reason, some purpose to continue to live. And so I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemies. Like I said, I may disagree with him from an ideological perspective, and I don't like his greater project. But from a human perspective, it's a tragedy that that anybody, him or anybody, gets paralyzed from the neck down in this kind of way. But that I'm appreciative of his perspective on it, his resilience, and and him showing to other people that like it is not the end of the world if you end up in this kind of position. You still can be happy. As long as you have the right mindset, anything is possible. Now, there's a second part to all of this, right? Put aside the gushy, emotional stuff. I'm trying to puff him up. This creates a giant power vacuum, right? He's almost out of the picture, right? You've watched him talk, right? He's literally totally stationary, paralyzed from the neck down, and isn't exactly the fastest talker. And it's clear that his talking has taken a bit of a hit. Because of the paralysis and whatnot. And so like, honestly, like his impact on the greater conservative movement and greater conservative project is, I think, significantly reduced, right? If you would have asked me 6 months ago, who's the conservative intelligentsia? Who are the intelligent, who are the intellectuals on the conservative side of the media sphere? Well, I would have said guys like Kirk, guys like Prager, and guys like maybe like Shapiro. Well, now Kirk's gone, and Prager is at least partially gone, if not might as well be gone, right? I have a hard time imagining that his impact is going to be outside of the PragerU like company and all of that stuff, right? His impact as a person, just as Dennis Prager, is going to be significantly reduced. And if that's the case, then there's quite the power vacuum right now going on the conservative media sphere, right? Especially on the more higher end pseudo-intellectual, faux intellectual side of it. There's quite the power vacuum. And so I'm interested to see if there's any greater longer term implications of having both Kirk and Prager. They weren't taken out of commission at the same time, but like over a year period, somewhat small. And so like, in a relatively short time, these two guys who were, very solidified in the movement, they had a very stable part in the movement. They're not there anymore. There's a power vacuum right now. And so I'm interested to see who or what is able to rise up in its place. While the Trump administration wages war against clean energy, it is now vowing to lease millions of acres of public lands at a discount and spend hundreds of millions of dollars to prop up the most polluting source of electricity, coal. This comes as the administration has restricted new solar and wind farms on federal lands and decried subsidies provided to these two renewable energy sources. The new policies announced Monday include giving $625 million to utilities to extend the life of aging coal-fired power plants. Such facilities would likely otherwise close because of the availability of cheaper energy sources. The coordinated actions from the Department of Interior, Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency would seek to open as much as 13.1 million acres of federal land to coal mining at reduced royalty rates. In addition, the EPA would ease regulations on water and air pollution to allow for the extension of coal power plants' lifetimes. So one thing to me that stands out of all of that paragraph the most is reduced royalty rates, right? Like this to me signals that this isn't so much about an ideological difference. We think climate change is a hoax and that we don't care about pollution, and we're going to allow you all to do that to the maximum extent, right? It's not about that, right? Maybe in part it's about that, but it's at least to some part, if not the biggest part, about enriching his homies, right? Reduced royalty rates. The idea that like you would think that if like they care, and also at the same time they're pretending like there's a budget crisis, right? Or that like we spend too much money as the government, or they pretend like they're fiscal conservatives, right? Like you can't at the same time be like, oh, we don't think climate change is a problem, and we're going to open up more of these lands to coal mining so that we can increase our energy grid capacity via coal plants. You wouldn't want to reduce their royalty rates because that's like there's no good faith reason to want to reduce their royalty rates like that, other than you were actively trying to facilitate these kind of things. And why would you want to try and facilitate these kind of things? Well, it's because your homeboys stand to make a lot of money if they do. Currently, coal provides about 16% of the United States electricity, a share that has fallen steeply in recent years as the cost of natural gas, wind, and solar energy has come down, and anti-pollution regulations have helped to convince utilities to close coal power plants. Coal mining has also fallen out of favor in recent decades as demand for the fuel has declined. Coal is the energy source that provides the most global warming pollution, and its decline in the U.S. has been helping to reduce the nation's emissions. Environmental groups denounced the new moves as a waste of money, a threat to public health, and a step backwards in the fight against human-caused global warming. Expanding mining and spending taxpayer money on burning coal while rolling back vital protections will only exacerbate the deadly pollution and rising electricity bills that communities are facing across the country, said Jill Tauber of Earth Justice in a statement. Clean energy and other climate solutions are driving significant growth in our economy, but this administration is choosing to throw its weight behind fossil fuel industries and stymie progress. The Trump administration's attempt to ban clean energy and prop up dirty and costly coal will not only cause costs to keep going up, but will also risk the health of our communities and threaten public lands that belong to all of us, said Matthew Davis of the League of Conservation Voters in a statement. The Trump administration, however, sees coal as a reliable source of base load power at a time when such energy sources are at a premium given rising electricity demands amid the artificial intelligence boom. The White House is prioritizing such energy sources, be it coal or nuclear power plants, over the cheapest sources of electricity today, which are wind and solar. I would think that I'm seeing he says they're prioritizing, be it coal or nuclear, right? I don't see so much prioritization of the nuclear, right? And I think it's for cynical reasons, right? I think they're more interested and have put much more effort into facilitating coal because the timetables for coal and nuclear are much different, right? For a coal-fired power plant, the time between investment necessary and the plant reaching profitability is far shorter of a time period than it is for nuclear power plants, right? Nuclear power plants are notoriously extremely expensive to like build and implement, but then you don't actually see the benefits of like a profitable cost equation or whatever with regards to the energy it produces and its upfront fixed cost. You don't see that for like 10 plus years, right? When for coal power plants, it's like only a couple of years. So I think maybe it's a little bit like they know that with coal plants, they could potentially see like an increase in the energy grid and reduction of energy costs, all within the scope of this Trump administration. But if they prioritize nuclear, they aren't going to see the positive impacts during this administration, right? It's going to be 1 or 2 administrations later, and Trump wants, they want to get as much, they want to be able to take as, they want the win basically. They want the short-term win over the better long-term win. Beautiful clean coal will be essential to powering America's reindustrialization and winning the AI race, Energy Secretary Chris Wright said in a statement. These funds will help keep our nation's coal plants operating and will be vital to keeping electricity prices low and the lights on without interruption. It just seems so like brazenly corrupt to me that they're wanting to do this at the exact same time that they're like cynically cutting all of these different, a whole bunch of funding for various types of green energy programs, right? To me, it just screams they're picking winners and losers, right? They are, and like I understand with a piece of legislation, in theory, there's winners and there's always going to be winners and losers, right? But this feels like they're explicitly choosing the legislation based on who those winners and who those losers are going to be, not like, oh, this is a good piece of legislation, let's implement it. And as a result, these guys will be benefit and these guys will have a negative consequence or whatever. They're working back. They're saying, no, they're working at it from the opposite direction, right? They're saying, okay, how can we help these guys and hurt these guys at the same time? Well, we implement this kind of policy, not we implement this kind of policy and it will affect these people in this kind of way. This is obviously the exact opposite thing that we should be doing. And the idea that they're going to do it all at reduced royalty rates even further supports the idea that this was just to enrich their homeboys. This isn't about increasing the energy grid, or there's no good faith equation, argument, reasoning, logic going on behind all of this, right? It's really just there's coal out there to be mined and there's money to be made. And the only thing stopping us is that damn federal government. And then I'm good friends with my boy Trump over there, so he's going to make it happen. I'm going to make a ton of money. Yeehaw! Yeehaw. Yeehaw. All righty, everyone. Well, that's all she wrote. It is Sunday, October 5th, 2025. I am Michael Winkler. And this has been The Mike Wink Show. Peace out, y'all.